Well, um, I'm really, really pleased to be able to have this conversation because it's one of those times where you stumble across somebody who has really, really great content. And I also owe a debt of gratitude to this gentleman because he introduced me to Julia Blau and Jeff Wagman through the interview he did with them, which was a face-to-face interview. Jealous of that, got to be honest. And introduced me to their great book, which I have been devouring, Introduction to Ecological Psychology. They were on the previous podcast. We did rehearse his surname. I'm going to have a go at it again. I'm probably going to get it wrong, but we'll do my best. Bren Veziroglu. Bren, welcome to the Talent Equation.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, amazing to be here.
Great. Great to have you. I wonder if I could just start the conversation off. I'd just love to hear your story. I know a little bit, obviously, following your content. Haven't devoured it all yet. Still relatively noob into that. But I'd love to know a little bit about, your whole journey in what you do, and also a little bit of like how you got into the whole ecological space. And who was it who gave you that blue pill? And now, are now down that full rabbit hole. So yeah, just give me the whole shebang.
Sure. So the abridged version is basically in high school. I think a lot of like strength coaches will identify with this. In high school, I started football, and I wasn't very athletic, and so I was terrible at it, and I was getting bullied literally on the field by another athlete. And he would just do whatever he wanted because I was so skinny, unathletic, weak. I was 5'3", 100 pounds, flat, So super, the perfect victim, you could say. But anyway, so the first season of football goes by, and I just said to myself, man, like I don't feel physically capable of defending myself, right? Like we could say that affordance
Mm.
wasn't present in my field of affordances, right? Of being able to do what I wanted to do on the field, it
Mm.
just felt completely at the will of other people who were stronger and faster and more athletic. So okay, I start lifting, and I started lifting, 3 hours a day, every day. I was there, super dedicated. I think between freshman and the end of senior year, after the first football season, I think there might have been 2 days the gym was open that I wasn't there. One of them was because the wrestling coach tried to recruit me, which, um, but anyway, so I was one of those people that you might call like a low baseline, high responder.
Nice.
So I responded really well to the strength training, strength wise, muscle mass wise. Um, and it was interesting because became sort of like almost like an aesthetic deterrent, like people, kind of stopped bullying. I didn't look like someone you would want to bully anymore.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that really became the main thing in my favor. Um, and so that was great. But as far as actually getting better at football, which was kind of my main goal, I really didn't improve despite getting way stronger, significantly bigger. I put on 45 pounds of muscle between freshman year and senior year, 30 of which was in the first year. And I got significantly faster. I think my 40 time went from like 5.67 to like a 4.9. So like a pretty big improvement. Um, and so like in the traditional strength and conditioning sense, it's like, okay, now you got all the things you need, right, to be a good player. Um, and I didn't experience that at all. So so that was my first little hint of like something's missing in this equation that this strength coach that's how we think about football to a large extent, right? And for those more familiar with like the research and some of the stuff with the NFL Combine, you see that with the NFL Combine. You test everyone's athleticism, and you have people that do really, really well that do pretty terribly on the field, and you have people that do kind of okay or badly on the combine tests, and then what do you know? It's Tom Brady.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Anyway, so I started college. I was like really into science and really into biochemistry. And I was looking at like disease prevention stuff. I was working on like really interested in Alzheimer's disease, but I ended up working on more Parkinson's, cancer. Um, I did some like protein X-ray crystallography for like the nerds out there. Um, and so it's hyper isolated. And so it's really not just you're not focused on the disease so much as like the pathway and the specific protein within the disease. Um, and it really started to feel like a luck-based process that like
Wow.
you hope your protein's important and you hope your small molecule will target that protein effectively, and you just don't know if it will and if it will have side effects. And I started around the same time that I started noticing that, I started getting drawn into the work of someone named Ido Portal.
Oh yeah.
And he talks about movement a lot. And so this idea of being a general movement practitioner rather than a specialist, and this
Yeah.
thing, movement intelligence, like one could say skill, like a skill in a general sense, as
Yeah.
far as how can you use your body rather than like what can you do on a bench press and a 40-yard, 40-yard dash. And so I started moving in that direction. So I finished my degree, and by that time I was just getting more and more into the movement direction and nutrition, and really thinking like, rather than trying to just work on this one protein, maybe it's a better approach. Maybe I could do more social good by working with the system in a more holistic sense, right? So okay, maybe this one protein, uh, maybe I would have success with that, maybe not. There's like a very small likelihood of like a really outsized return. Or I could work with kind of facilitating movement for people and inspiring people to do more movement and sleep better and eat better and all this stuff that is a very high likelihood of actually quite good effects, right? We know this. We kind of ignore it. We sweep it under the rug because we know it, because you can't, it's probably unlikely that you're going to cure too many diseases by just having generally healthier habits. But even that, like there's a question about that. And what's unquestionable about that is you're going to do a lot better for a lot longer, right? So that's when I started working on movement, and I started teaching movement professionally. Um, and then from there, I guess the last big shift was I learned about ecological dynamics. There was a grappling coach that was using it. And so I spent like I moved out here to study with that coach, train at the gym, and been basically making a documentary about it for the last 2 years now. I just really started with like, okay, I want to make a video about this. This is important. And then the scope of the project just kept expanding because I'm like, this is so important and I need to dig deeper, and there's so much to dig into. And for the people that I was talking to a coach a week or two ago, and he was telling me, this is a very successful coach, and he was telling me, man, like this ecological dynamic stuff. He's trying to make a video explaining it to like the lay people, right?
Yeah.
And I was helping him with that. He's like, man, this stuff is so hard. Like, I don't know if it's hard for you, but like, this is so hard for me to understand. And I was just thinking, for everyone that's like in those situations, I really think ecological dynamics has been harder for me to learn than quantum mechanics with the quantum mechanics classes I did in college. Like, this is tough. There is so much depth everywhere. It's depth and breadth, right? Because there's so many different fields that are all amalgamating to like what is ecological dynamics. Like usually when people define ecological dynamics and they say like, okay, parent fields are this, this, and that, like they skip over a lot of different fields that are actually like it's enormous.
Mm.
Um, so it's been a huge project and very exciting. And the more I learn about it, um, frankly, the more excited I am about it. And the more I've been practicing it and lately starting to apply it to other fields, um, it's really interesting. So for movement practitioners, so this is this thing of like drilling, right? And I think you're big on the not drilling thing. So, like minds, but it's this is this pervasive coaching assumption, right? This coming from probably ideas about a general motor program, about fundamental skills that we can learn, we can store in the brain, and then we can recall them later. And it leads coaches to want to isolate those things and drill them and get them perfect and have the students do it just right, just like you like it to be done, because you think that's the most effective way to do it. Um, and you probably have reasons to think that way, right? And that has some effect on skill. Like it clearly has some, you learn something, right? But what we're saying in ecological dynamics is more that you're not learning what you think you're learning. And because you're not learning what you think you're learning or what your coach thinks you're learning, it's actually a much less effective practice than it's designed to be, right? Like one might assume if we were storing motor programs, that drilling would be a lot more effective because then you could recall it and then you should see that drilling outperforms things like the CLA and differential learning in practice, which is not what we see. Um, and then a lot of the evidence for how coordination happens and perceptual learning in ecological dynamics wouldn't it wouldn't be there, but it is,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Anyway,
Mm.
um, so for sport practitioners, when you specialize, it's not that big of a deal in some ways because it's like okay, you're practicing a movement that at least that movement or variations of it are in your sport, right?
Mm.
So
Mm.
okay, right? Like for instance, soccer, right? Maybe you're drilling penalty kicks, right? And maybe you're doing it without a goalie, right? Well, at least you're going to do penalty kicks at some point in soccer, right? You're going to
Yeah.
have a goalie, but at least there's going to be some sort of penalty kick. In
Yeah.
movement, when we look at this like really broad scope, now we're looking far beyond like even soccer, right? So if you're to drill penalty kicks and then look at your transfer to like dance,
Yeah.
that's going to be far, far less. So
Yeah.
it's for movement practitioners, the effectiveness for us of the CLA and ecological dynamics approaches compared to like drilling and repetition based approaches is so much higher.
Mm.
Um, Again, I think that's because at a fundamental level, it's just more consistent with how we think everything is happening.
Mm.
And that's sort of where I'm at now. Yeah.
Wow. There's so much to unpack, but I mean, that's such a great introduction. I love it. And I love that sort of that journey. There's a few little areas I want to just threads I want to pull on. The first one was one of the things that struck me and in all the time I've been doing this and speaking to different people, there does seem to be a pattern emerging, which is that individuals have had uh, a negative sports experience in some way due to uh, physiological challenges or something along those lines. So for me, it was similar. I was probably about, at 15 or 16, still probably about 5'3" and 100 pounds, which is one of the reasons I found field hockey as opposed to, say, rugby or soccer, were because, the physicality elements just didn't have as much of an impact. But I was also born with um, disability, which was corrected through surgery at birth, but did leave me with some physical limitation. And so, of course, then you're finding the sport that, you're adapting, aren't you, to try and find the sports that you could. So I had that sort of experience. And then subsequently, through my own like journey, if you like, that sort of developmental journey, I found myself looking for different solutions, looking for those answers. You know what I mean? And so I suppose sort of it's almost that journey of discovery and that journey of adaptability that is definitely a feature. And I think I've heard these similar stories too with lots of people that I've spoken to over the years that, they've had some sort of unsatisfactory sports experience that was defining for them as young people, some sort of traumatic, not traumatic necessarily, we're going a bit too far. But anyway, the other thing I was going to say that was really interesting was when you talked about ecological dynamics being really hard and really like you say, really deep and really broad. I think it is, but it depends how much of the breadth and depth you want to go into, because I actually think in reality, it's actually, I've often heard people say that for practitioners, like it's just so complex for anyone to take
Mm.
on board. I'm not sure it is, in the sense that I work with a lot of young coaches who seem to grasp onto it really easily. And I think it's almost like when you have to relearn a language. Like, whereas if you grow up
Mm.
and you're just immersed in it, it just
Mm.
becomes normalized for you. Because I actually think it sort of speaks to a very naturalistic way of learning and learning to move and all those sorts of things. It's just that because we've almost got used to this overly sciencified, super reductionist, super technical, technically driven model of coaching and learning in movement, pedagogical approaches, that's become it's hard to unlearn. So like I'm like one of the classic practitioners where 20 years of my coaching was steeped in information processing, cognitive
Mm.
approaches. I was all about structure. I was all about rigidity. I was all about drilling and repetition and choreography almost. And the more organized and structured we were, the more successful we were going to be. And that does get you quite far, particularly back in the day when there weren't many coaches around. Just getting a team a bit organized meant you had an advantage, generally speaking. But it only goes so far, in the sense that then all of a sudden some team does something different and your team can't adapt. And that's when you just lose your mind as a coach and you just feel like you've got no chance. So it's just really interesting to so anyway, just circling back to that, I actually think that when you have to unlearn that, and I still struggle, because there are times when that there is a naturalistic tendency because of your training and your years of training that you're having to unlearn. And it's one of the reasons why I advocate for ditching the drills, because I had to put a constraint on myself to completely leave behind all of the artifacts from previous techniques and to only immerse myself in a new approach. It was a bit like it's like an akin to moving to another country and never using a translation device or whatever it is, just immersing yourself in the language and the culture and then learning as you go through trial and error, etc., etc. So I just made that decision to put that constraint on myself because I felt like it was my only real way of properly exploring this particular world. Plus, it had just so much explanatory power. It just mapped onto my worldview. I was so unsatisfied with my previous experiences.
Mm.
So, like, I have so much conflict, so much tension, so much challenge. Spent lots of time apologizing to people because of the fact that things weren't going right. And I was getting frustrated with them for not adhering to my
Mm.
idealized notion. I
Hmm.
make myself sound like I was an absolutely horrific coach. I don't think I was that bad, but I feel like I was that bad now. Now I've discovered something else. But that was nothing like my childhood. That was nothing like the joy I found in sport and physical activity. And I'm having to coach in a way because I felt like it was the only way to do it that really didn't graft onto my own values and my own sense of who I was. And it's only really through it, and I nearly gave up. I got very, very close to giving up. And it's only through finding ecological dynamics that I actually found, wow, I've got a whole new lease of life. Can actually explore an entirely different paradigm that actually felt much, much more aligned to how I felt coaching should be. And only since you might have heard me speak about this, I don't know, but only since I've been coaching ecologically have I actually ever experienced flow in coaching. And
Mm.
I've experienced it about 5 or 6 times, purely immersed, fully integrated, challenging, difficult, but just in the space and the time disappears. And it's magical. And actually, some of the things that happen with the fleet is magical. It feels magical because like it's happening, but it's not directed. You're not being a puppeteer. You're not having to force it. You're not having to put somebody into like this industrialized notion of how they ought to become something that they may or may not want to. You're not saying do this. I know it's not inherently enjoyable, but it's going to be good for you in the future. You're not force feeding broccoli in people's faces. What you're doing is you're saying to them, here's something really tasty. And you know what? It's really nutritious as well. It's like the ultimate win-win proposition as a sports experience practitioner. Sorry, I was on a rant. I'll pause.
No, I love the when I talked to Cal, it was the same way. Like he had a few rants and I had a few rants, and we're both like, yes, it's great. I mean, it's so. I wonder if some people maybe don't who haven't made the switch yet, maybe will struggle to understand why we're so passionate about this and why people are so passionate about this. It's totally I totally back up what you're saying here that it's like there's so many coaching problems that with it we just couldn't solve with the traditional approach. And if you really like the more you care as a coach, the more it's so tough, right? And when you're adhering to that traditional approach and you really think that there's this one idealized way to do this thing, like here's how you're going to kick a soccer ball if you want to score a goal, and here's how you do it when you're going to pass. And it's just like, these guys, why aren't we drill it, we drill it, we drill it, and then why aren't they sticking to that? Right? Like they're just not disciplined enough. Maybe we need to do more reps. But now they still did something different. But like, he scored. So like, okay, like, we'll let that one go. But like, that's still a bad habit, right? Because he
Yeah.
didn't make contact with the right part of the shoe, right? And it's so freeing to be able to let that go through a better understanding of what's actually happening and why athletes want to make contact with different parts of the shoe. Why they want to do the solution differently every time, right? It's a different problem every time. Different
Mm.
intentions, different environment. Yeah, and I also yeah, I really like what you said about the difficulty of this. I think probably you're right that maybe I think most of the difficulty comes if you're trying to go deep into the theoretical landscape,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's not necessary for most coaches. And I've actually had given the same advice already to because now it's really cool because I'm starting to talk to a lot of coaches lately that they're like, okay, ecological dynamics, like I don't totally get all of what it is yet, but like, all right, I'm on board. Like I understand enough that I'm on board. Like tell me like how should I go about doing this? Like what should I how should I change what I'm doing? Like what should I do instead? And I give the same advice like for it would depend on the sport, but in function oriented sports, so sports where how you do the solution, for instance, if soccer was judged by how you kick the soccer ball rather than did you score a goal, then we would want to do more drilling so that people kick the soccer ball in the way that like they're going to get scored on, right? Rather than actually scoring the goals. So for coaches in sports or outside of sports, like as far as like movement coaches, practitioners, I give the same advice. Like, don't have your students drill anything. No drill, like only tasks.
Mm.
And I think if you adhere to that, I think you can skip a lot of the depth of like the theoretical stuff. Like I think you're right that like it's the coaches that we've really been steeped in this stuff for decades that we've got to really go back. You have to really understand why we're saying that we should use tasks if you're really that deep in using drills already.
Mm.
Probably.
Mm.
Because what I see a lot of now is like, okay, there's coaches that have been doing drills for a long time. They switch to eco. They're using tasks. They switch to eco, but they still do drills here and there, and it's
Mm.
still somewhat repetitive. And they don't do them too much, but again, it's coming from. Then it's like, okay, if you really understood this deeply, you probably wouldn't be doing that, or you at least wouldn't be doing that in this way.
Yeah.
And so that's where, yeah, you probably got to grapple with some of the books now, right? But yeah, for the newer practitioners that like haven't had any of that stuff yet, if you're in a dynamic function oriented sport, like just use tasks and like already you're going,
Yeah.
And then I think there's still probably some depth. Actually, that'd be an interesting question for you. If you had a young coach, they're in a function oriented sport, say they're totally sold. They're like, man, I'm just only going to use tasks. We're not going to drill anything repetitively. Would you say they need to go deeper into the theory? And what do you think they would get out of that?
Well, when you say deeper, I suppose it depends on what how deep you need to go. It's an
Sure,
interesting discussion, that is.
sure.
So, for example, do I find the concept of Tao useful in my practice? No. Um, you know, so um, but actually understanding and knowing that there is this thing called tau, which is about, the rate of closure of an object that I might then use in an interceptive capacity. The fact that I know that and I know that it exists and it's a thing, um, is enough. It's enough for me to know that that's I don't have to know the precise calculations that, dynamical systems theory would want me to do and get all mathematical about it. I'm no mathematician, and trust me, I'm not. But I know that there is an idea and a concept that talks about rate of closure as a thing, and when you understand rate of closure in that way, as juxtaposed against previous ideas about like essentially the brain making predictions based on kind of the information it was gaining and then determining where we need to go and actually saying no, there's this dynamic interaction continuously flowing between environment, object, human organism, and it's a system in itself, not two things in isolation and one making sense of the world. So when you understand that notion and then you understand that, that all that does is basically give you the framing you need in order to think about design, think about environment design as a learning space. Now, but so what I'm trying to say is that's about as deep as I think I need to go to be a really effective practitioner. Now, if I was working, say, in a high performance environment with extremely detailed, almost getting to the like what you were doing, where you're almost getting to the is it the protein and the pathway that's actually going to make you can get down to that level of granularity with by working at that level and really beginning to understand what the um, key impacts are and the kind of key what's the word I'm looking for, the things that catalyst, if you like, that begin the process. You can get into that, and I think it's probably important for scientists to do that, to fully understand some of the mechanisms. But at a practitioner level, I don't think you need that. Somebody said to me once that being having a PhD or being a PhD candidate is knowing everything there is to know about the smallest little thing. Being a coach or a practitioner is knowing a bit enough about a lot of things. The more specialized you become as a coach, I think the more limited you potentially become. But you still have to have enough depth. It's always a difficult question to know where that depth is. So the bigger challenge, I think, with the ecological approach is the breadth, right? Because I actually think there is a lot to know, and there's a lot to explore, and there's a lot to sort of take into account. And there are so many dimensions that sometimes actually that becomes a bit paralyzing.
Yeah.
The more you know, the more almost you become a bit paralyzed. And there have definitely been times when I haven't necessarily in the moment been able to make the right adaptation, partly because I had about 4 conflicting ideas in my mind, whereas previously I wouldn't have had that problem. So sometimes there can be a bit too much information can be an issue. That said, one of the things I think that's more important to understand for practitioners in particular is that this is just a completely different lens through which to look at the development of movement in humans. It's not a lens where what you're doing is you're analyzing the component parts of movement, chopping them up into their component parts, working on the component parts, and then reassembling them in some sort of competitive environment, right? That's a fundamental idea about learning that was only really brought about through sports science, video analysis, and our ability to look at things in slow motion so that we could see what these movements are, we could name them, we could give them technical ideas, and then we could teach them. So we've been technology has acted as an affordance to enable us to break down movement patterns and teach them. And that then, because of the technology, we were able to study it. Because we're able to lab-based study it, we develop an industry based on a flawed idea of how people learn. We've got loads of information about techniques. And the assumption is that we develop a technique and that's going to become a magical skill. Technique and skill are totally different things. So when you understand actually that the environment presents you with information that is absolutely critical to the development of movement capability. When you understand that and you work backwards from the environment towards the individual and then work interactively between those two things, everything shifts, everything changes. You're no longer interested in the information you can put into the human so they can make sense of the environment. You're interested in creating an environment and then seeing how the human interacts with it. And then we really start to play together. And that's when the joy starts to happen. And once you get into that and you see not only the impact of it, but also the the enjoyment and the genuine sense of curiosity, exploration, freedom, creativity that comes with working with somebody in that way, you just can't go back.
100%. And it's kind of like you were saying earlier about like, yeah, like it's hard, but it's also so much more fun and engaging. Like that's one of the things I've been playing a lot lately with mobility tasks.
Mm.
And so like rather than, you know, mobility training right now is still very isolated, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do this stretch, we're going to do that stretch, we're going to do that stretch. And you have different ways you could do it. You could do it static, you could do it active, you could do it dynamic, you could do ballistic. Um, you could do, I'll give this, I'm a little gonna like beat on this methodology because it's kind of an easy target. But it is very good, is like FRC, right? And so FRC, their main thing is locking down every other joint. And then you're going to do like circles in different types through the full range of motion of whatever joint you're targeting. And you're going to do it really actively and really, really challenge it, right? So that's a really great, it works well. Um, but it's so, when you look at that from an ecological dynamics perspective, oh my God, that is so isolated, such a linear like approach, right? It's like, okay, we're gonna forget the mobility of like multiple muscle groups at once, or like multiple joints at once. We're gonna target one joint at a time, and then ideally we're gonna assume that when you go back to your sport or go back to your daily life that everything's just gonna like work together nicely, right? Because you just built up the individual parts, right? Uh, and so rather than doing that, we can build tasks where you have to use the whole structure together, every joint, right? So, okay, you're standing on one leg. I give you a target. Okay, don't touch your other leg to the floor. You've got to touch your hand to this target, and I move it around different directions. Every joint is fair game, right? Every joint could be and should be contributing towards you getting to that target. And hence, rather than locking everything else down, everything is not only a lot of things are developing mobility and being challenged near their end range of motion, but other things are learning to like help balance, right? There's so many different aspects that are now present that we're completely missing when we isolate, to the extreme in something like FRC or any sort of traditional stretching mobility program. Um, and then it becomes this thing where it's hard because we're challenging it, but
Yeah.
it's so much more fun.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
really think that it's more fun that like, and it comes back to what you're saying earlier about like the negative like sport experience, like I think the tragedy of the traditional approach is that the more disciplined you are as a person, as an athlete, the more you stuck to the like, if I just do more reps, I'll get good at the thing, the more tragic it is because the less that actually helps you. It was the less disciplined people that were like, ah, yeah, I'll do some reps here, and then I'm gonna go play this game, then I'm gonna go play, then I'm gonna go play outside, I'm gonna play tag with my friends. That okay, and we would say, ah, you're just athletic, right? Because we
Mm.
because we can't explain why those people are so good at the stuff because
Mm.
they didn't do the reps. So if they're skilled and they didn't do the reps, oh, you must be talented.
Yeah.
Versus, oh, actually, the other things you were doing were contributing more towards skill development than the actual reps you were doing. So actually, what you did made more sense than what we were telling you to do. And now with this approach, it's like now what we're saying actually makes sense, actually works, right? It works for like true skill development, right? Not just like doing the motor program this way, but like, can you score the goal against the goalie with other players like rushing you, right? This actually works for developing that, right? This actually works for um, develop. If someone's trying to strangle you, how do you get out, right? Like teaching a certain movement is only going to get you so far, and working with the tasks and the function just takes you so much farther. And then it's so great that it's also more fun. And I really think that that funness, that engagement, that like we instinctively think and feel that drilling is boring, repetitively is boring, and we don't want to do it. I think that's because we have an intuitive sense that it doesn't work. I don't think it's just that we're not disciplined. I think it's that we feel that that isn't helpful.
Yes, and I also think one of the reasons why movement repetition, movement repetition that isn't necessarily enjoyable, inherently enjoyable and fun, has more worth. There has to be
Mm,
value in the thing that's hard. If it's
mm,
enjoyable, if it's enjoyable and fun and frivolous, it can't have worth. Like only we've sort of like there's this narrative, isn't there, in Western societies that you've got to put the work in. And so actually, if it's joyful, it's like, well, it can't have value. No, no, no. It has to be something that it isn't enjoyable for it to really be valuable. And then that then speak to the narrative we love to tell ourselves about grit and determination and all those sorts of things. Like, if I came to one of your mobility sessions and you and me have got big smiles on our faces and we're having a whale of a time and I'm doing these crazy tasks standing on one leg, everyone's just going to think that that's not got any worth. They're having too much fun. He needs to be sweating and miserable and handing over hundreds of dollars because actually there's value in that. I do think there's a perverse sort of like thing there.
totally. And that's a great point too, that, people always in the grappling community, there's this phrase like drillers are killers, you know? I'm not sure if that comes up so much in other sports, but drillers are killers. And they tend to point out like it's these champion athletes that they always stay after practice and they drill for another hour, right? And so that it must be the drilling that's creating the success. And I really think like, you know, okay, that's not fun, right? And the people that are winning have a tendency to be the people that are staying after, like doing extra work, and they're doing everything they can that could contribute, and they're doing the things that aren't fun as well as the things that are more fun. And there's a psychological advantage that comes with that, that potentially is more valuable than the repetitions themselves of, oh yeah, when it comes time for the game and you're like, oh yeah, those guys went home after practice. I stayed an extra hour to work hard, right? Like, that gives you some confidence. There's an edge that can come to that, you
I
know?
think I think with elite or more advanced performers, I think there is some value in in movement repetition as a maintenance thing and as a confidence thing. And also because they have a more attuned sense of the movement problem that they may have discovered within their more live experience previously in the session, they they then can then take that and they'll keep it very live in their, it's obviously going to be a relatively isolated repetition opportunity. So they're not going to necessarily have the other information factors, but they will have a liveness to it. They will be doing it for a purpose. A golfer, for example, I was up late last night watching the Masters, watching my man Rory get his Masters. But a golfer, for example, like famously, like might hit 100 shots, right? And it looks like it's like mindless repetition, but it's not because what they've done is they're creating conditions that they've discovered a problem with. Famously, somebody like Padraig Harrington, for example, would hit shots off a very, very, very hard piece of wood because he knew he was going to be playing on a golf course that was going to have very, very hard ground, and he wanted to learn to play off that. So his repetition, but that wouldn't be the bulk of his practice time. That would be more the add-on that so that's not his main course. That's his, no, I wouldn't say it's his dessert, but it's kind of his additional. It's like his protein shake, if you like, something along those
Hmm.
lines that he adds to his diet, but not to the exclusion of the reps he would get in a more dynamic environment. This idea of drillers are killers, I like that. That's a good notion. What I like about it is what they're right. They just don't realize that they're killing themselves.
Nice. That's interesting though what you're bringing up because I will say I intuitively felt that for a while that I was suspected if drilling. Okay, so there's the clear aspect of like, and again, the research backs this to a significant degree that if you're trying to learn to do something a specific way, you want repetitions of trying to do it that specific way, and having feedback that helps guide you towards doing it that specific way is helpful, right? Traditional approach beats using constraints to a degree. Um, but then,
Yeah.
okay,
So if you want to develop a technique, great, crack on. But that's
crack
not
on.
skill.
Right, 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 right. And most sports, that's not what we're trying to do, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, but then, yeah, after that, I always felt like, if there's a point of drilling for all the other stuff, it's probably got to be for the experts, right? Because it really does
Yeah.
make sense. Yeah, there is. I can add a felt sense to that, and like some coaching experience with that as well. Like for instance, okay, so I did a sumo tournament uh last October with a few YouTuber friends, and we did it with no experience. We just went in the night before. We had our friend was coach us. He was like, "Here's the circle. This is what you do. You know, here's the opening ceremony," and and then we ran some tasks. We're like, "Okay, we're gonna just like spar." And tell us what we should try to do and what we should try not to do. And then we went and did the competition the next morning, right? And so, and then we did quite well. And I really think, and it was very interesting. I came back, and this is not to brag. Again, this is not like a really about me so much as like the practice design. I went to another, came back, went to another sumo club, and I trained with them, and I beat all of them,
Mm.
having never practiced sumo before. And yet, I think few of any of the guys at the practice I had been to had competed at all. And they were practicing in these like very decomposed, very passive ways of like, here's how we walk through the circle. They weren't even doing things with a partner, right? It's just, here's how you do the walk, right? So having already competed and having the context of this is what it's going to be like when we're running at each other 100% and we collide, and then these are the things that are going to happen. I think then to then drill and repeat something, I would have some sort of context to bring that back into,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than just doing the reps, never having done the competition or even like the live sparring, you really don't have a context to like put that in, right?
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
really it's probably really even more limited. But there's a few studies on experts where the CLA is doing better, and it's not doing better than the traditional approach. So it's not clear right now from the research if the CLA is like really better for like experts or beginners. But then Yeah, I'm curious to hear you expand more on where you feel the role of repetition for experts is, because then I always think, to me, if it's a function oriented sport, I think if there's a way we could design a task to do this thing, it would be better.
But by the way, it would still be task led.
Sure. Okay.
So it
Yeah.
wouldn't just be movement repetition. Like I would
Mm,
never suggest or even accept that somebody going out there doing like, a tennis player going out there doing like air swings was going to bring them some benefit, right?
mm,
And some people do want to say, particularly the traditionalists who want to hold on to their method, and they argue for methodological pluralism, a bit of both, mixed diet,
mhm,
it's a sensible way to go. And then paint the ecological practitioner as being an evangelical purist who's, dogmatic about their approach, guilty as charged. I always feel that when you're looking through the ecological lens, then what you're going to do is, even if you're going as an individual, you're still being task led. You're still going to be challenged by the task in some way. Now, what I'm talking about, you see, is for the expert who might say, for example, I know, and the issue with the CLA is that well, ideally, to have something that's representative, you need in a team game, for example, other people because they're important. They're important informationally to the environment as to your movement action. It's defined by the others. But um, when you but if you haven't got others, so you're on your own, like so, it's an after the session type activity. Then you're then naturally you're constrained. So the activity is impoverished from a purely ecological perspective, but there's still value in if you've got the time of utilizing the time to put time into developing your effectivities or your action
mm,
capacities.
mm, mm,
Um, but you would do it in a very task-led way. So for me, I would always say, for example, even when there's a video of me actually done by the same videographer that did the one with Cal Jones we were talking about before we jumped on, of me working one to one with my son. And you know, I'm being the really passive defender, pretending that I'm doing it passively, but actually working really quite hard. And actually, he's just going past me like fun because he's 17, ridiculously fast. But anyway, but we create task, right? So he's essentially doing isolated practice, pretty much, right? It's isolated in the sense that it hasn't. There's not really a defender to deal with, apart from a human that you've got to think about going past. So there's some element of that, but really, we're in exploration mode around striking the ball towards the goal and trying to get it in the goal. But we're always having tasks. So the task might be exploring different ways of approaching the shot, low to the ground, more stretched out away from you, closer to the body. We're doing a lot of exploration of those ideas, creating a search space. Or it might be our task is we've got to hit the sideboard of the goal so that it goes in. We're hitting the corners of the goal, and we're going to try and aim for that and see how many of those that we can get and task ourselves in that way. It all depends on the information I'm getting from the athlete as to the response that I'm going to put in place and the constraint. Now that's me being his coach, working in a one v zero, 1v1, 1v half type approach. But if you're purely 1v0, it's just you can still derive enormous amounts of value from, you know, just going and hitting lots of goes and having lots of goes at hitting and exploring. If you've got the contextual understanding of the task you're trying to perform in relation to its game reality. And the problem is for me is that I see so many athletes just mindlessly performing movement rituals. And it's the mindlessness and the fact that it bears very little resemblance in their movement actions to what would actually happen in the game that actually is where the problem lies. So, yeah, so I'm not suggesting for a second that mindless repetition or just even doing artificial movements brings you any value really. I think the jury, I personally think that gives you absolutely zero value, and you'd be better off going home and resting, to be honest.
Mhm.
But somebody might say it might give you like 1%, and I'm like, well, if you want to kill yourself for 1%, crack on. But actually, with very, very little additional design parameters added to that activity, all of a sudden you've just enriched it enormously. So when I talk about ditching the drills and people think that me advocating someone doing that is drilling, it's not. It's something entirely different because of everything we've put into it, all the variability that's really important. We've added in, it's baked into the activity. So it's no longer an isolated movement pattern. Run to this cone, run to that cone, run to this cone, run to that cone, do it completely mindlessly, be a complete automaton, and think that that's going to magically transform into skilled performance. It's not, but we're not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where like some nuance of like I think it'd be hard for a coach to do stuff like that effectively without having a pretty nuanced understanding of ecological dynamics, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like if you're like tasks only representative things, okay, go, like you can get pretty far, but then to like for someone with that level of understanding to then design a like something like this where it's not going to be totally useless. And like you said, like there's always I think there's some level of skill that comes out of any sort of practice. But
Mhm.
there's also value that comes out of resting, out of sleep, out of just meditation after practice.
Yeah,
And this it's a contextual world, right? There's a point where the returns you're getting out of like just kicking the soccer ball the same way over and over is less than the returns of going home and sleeping, right? And so it that 1% may actually in context be a negative return.
yeah, I
You
agree.
know?
And definitely, there's lower diminishing returns, 100%. But some people are just so wedded to the idea of doing something is better than doing nothing. That they would just always go and do something. And personally, I would say I think like you say, there's lots of other things that you could do that would add an enormous value to your sporting experience and your life as well. Like if you're starting to do that kind of thing to the exclusion of, other really important parts of your life to the point where actually you think you've got to get to the grind so hard all the time that eventually you either physically break, or you mentally break, you burn out or whatever it might be. Um, that's the bigger fear, isn't it? Right. So let's make it enriched as much as we possibly can so that we should, and as coaches as well, I believe that unless you've got a really good reason for somebody to do something, and you can clearly articulate the value in it, you shouldn't prescribe it. It's kind of unethical, really. And I think too many coaches haven't got the rationale. That's also, I think, where some of the negativity towards ecological dynamics comes from. Because ecological dynamicists have a very, very strong rationale. We're super passionate about it. We're knowledgeable. We've got a deep understanding. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't. We've got a very, very strong why behind what we're doing. And it exposes the fact that some other coaches haven't got that. They haven't necessarily got that depth. What they've got is folk pedagogy that they've always used because it's always been done that way, but they've never really considered why. I must have asked 4,000 coaches in my time traveling the world, doing workshops. Must have asked 4,000 coaches, why do you coach the way you coach? Why do you do what you do the way that you do it? And the answer is, I had this experience and I liked it, so I want more people to have it. I had this experience, I didn't like it, I don't want anybody else to have it. They're the two answers I get. It's never, this is my education, this is what I read. Um, it's I saw that somebody do that. It's folk pedagogy, right? But it's uncritical. You don't find many ecological practitioners like that. You don't find ecological practitioners going, "Oh, I work ecologically because the bloke next to me does." It doesn't work like that, really. They're much, much more intentional, it seems. I mean, I might be over egging the pudding a bit about the ecological community, but the conversations I have, they're not like this, generally speaking, when I work with normal coaches. It's massively surface level. You ever start to ask these questions and they start to get quite defensive and negative. But you speak to an ecological practitioner, they're only too willing to talk to you about it ad nauseum, forever, go into the weeds.
Sure. And to be fair, probably a lot of that is because ecological dynamics is still newer and less popular, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
hopefully in 50 years, you know, when there's the next paradigm comes along, maybe sooner,
Yeah.
that maybe ecological dynamics now is the folk pedagogy. And now now the new guys are having to like start the conversation and bring that up, you know?
I
But
think it'll evolve. I think it'll evolve. You see, I don't necessarily. I used to think that ecological psychology, ecological dynamics was juxtaposed against cognitive information processing. And I have advocated that actually, and probably in some respects, maybe not necessarily helped the debates because I needlessly created this sort of, kind of us against them type model. Some of that just goes with the territory. When you articulate something differently and people are arguing with you, you end up doing that. But I might have been guilty of that. I actually don't see it like that anymore. I actually think it's more of an evolution. So it's like, we used to think that putting leeches on people was a good form of medicine, right? I'm not saying that cognitive approaches like drills are like leeches. Maybe they are. I don't know. But anyway, it's an equivalent. Like, at one stage we thought that was valuable. We know more now, and actually there's time to move on. You can hold on to that stuff if you want to. You can prescribe somebody really advanced medications that's going to be really healthy for them and still do the leeches if you want. But my argument would be you might want to let go of some of that stuff. I better stop it with the leeches.
that's good. I might use that actually. The leeches are good. But well, you mentioned something about like the effectivities and the action capacities that I think is important to talk about. That, like, I think when we're using repetition to, like you're saying, like it's develop the maximum capacity of what you're doing, like that can be helpful, right? Like, def if you have a good rationale,
Yes.
right? So, like one of the things Rob Gray was talking about in his new book was the bat speed, right?
Mm.
So there was some sort of like a vision tracking error when the ball makes contact with the bat, and so the more you reduce that error of essentially like what information are they tracking, the better they do. But if their maximum bat speed is only so high, like that gives you a ceiling of
Mm.
how much they're going to improve because they can only hit the ball that hard. And so especially when you have players that like they can only that you've tracked that, you've isolated it, you're sure that is a limiting thing. Now you can say, okay, for this guy, yeah, maybe we want him to do some reps is like just swing that bat as hard as you can so that you can swing the bat faster
Mm.
with some idea that like, and I guess the idea is we're not developing skill when we're doing that. We're developing
No.
something different, right? We're
Yeah.
developing action capacity.
Yeah.
That's when using repetition could be more helpful.
Yeah. And also, uh, we would probably argue. So go back to right at the start of this, you were telling me the story about how, you were small, not very strong, not very athletic. So you worked really hard on building the musculature that was going to give you the ability to be stronger and to withstand the challenges. Didn't necessarily make you a better player, though.
Not at all. I would argue not at all. and 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 my coaches would agree. So it's not just me, you know.
Whereas, so had for example, you developed functional movements, developed strength through functional movements that were equated to the demands of the positions that you were playing, then there's an argument that you would have had a better, I'm not saying guaranteed, but you'd have had a better chance of improving your. So I do feel like you can improve, you would want to, as an ecological practitioner, always be looking to develop action capacities and effectivities with some accordance to the realities of the dimension of the activity that you're involved in. Because I don't, and this is one of the reasons, this is one of the things that Tyler from Emergence talks about when he talks about like, ecological dynamics for the weight room. It's about developing functional movement capacities because to speak to what you were talking about earlier on when you're talking about like when you isolate movement, like people don't realize, do they, that, when you were doing that one-legged task, your toes are involved in that. You don't know that
Hmm.
because you're not aware of
Hmm.
it consciously, but they are, because it's what's keeping you upright, massively, dynamically involved in that. Well, if you were to do that action without the one-leggedness, that didn't involve the toes, that where you were either sat or immobilized and you were just doing the target thing, the minute you tried to do the target thing with the one-leggedness, you're not going to be able to do it because the toes haven't been engaged in that activity. So that's a very simplistic example, though, of how like the body is moving in functional ways that we are not aware of. We're not consciously making these things happen. They are responses to demands being presented by tasks, by things in the environment asking us questions. And the body's responding to that synergistically, not because you've been given this general motor program that you've plugged in and has gone into your toes to say, when we do the one-legged target activity, you're going to need to activate. I mean, like that's it's one of the things, by the way, I love about the audio book from Julia and Jeff's book is there's times when she's explaining some of these ideas and she actually laughs because they seem so ridiculous when you're talking about them. She almost can't help herself. I've found it. I've been walking along, walking my dog in the morning, listening to the audio book, just laughing and smiling, listening to Julia actually narrate that book. It's amazing. Anyway, but I'm saying it to you now with a smile on my face, going, like, who grafts onto that as an idea? Who actually thought that was good? That was a good concept and the best way of explaining how humans move. Because it's not like anybody's real world experiences. I don't know where I got onto that. I'm on a whole different channel down there, a whole different alleyway. But I guess just to circle back, it comes back to this point of um, when we are developing action capacities and effectivities, I've heard people, you see, hear Rob talk about that and they go, aha, chink in the armor. Ha ha ha. Drilling's good. See? Because you've got to develop the action capacities and the effectivities. And I go, not so fast. Not so fast. If you think that's the way, because you're still thinking that way, aren't you? Yeah? No, 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 no. We're coming at it from a totally different lens, remember? It's a totally different way of thinking about movement. Anyway, sorry.
No, but this is a really great point, and this is an area that I think they have that little man. This is quite a good plug for them, but I think they've got a little course on their website of ecological dynamics for the weight room. And I
Yeah.
haven't. I want to buy that actually. I want to look into. I really am interested to hear what people are saying about that because I'll tell you, like from a movement perspective, one of the things that has been very obvious to me from a pretty early time was we're trying we were always trying to develop everything, right? Okay, we need to do every sport, so we need to develop every capacity. And it becomes so obvious so quickly, like it's just so hard to do that, you know? You every sport you do, every different sport, it has these unique demands on certain body parts in certain ranges of motion that it's just like you couldn't you can't develop it almost feels like you can't develop all of those in these isolated ways. Like it has to be in the like you it feels like you couldn't do it without doing the sport. And
Yes.
and then it does bring us to this really interesting point of like, how much value does it have to use a CLA for physicality development, right?
Mhm.
Where we're saying actually, for instance, it'd be pretty. Oh, like there's a game for grappling that I haven't run yet, but I've been thinking about it. Of like, okay, uh, okay, two people grappling, right? And let's
Mhm.
say so normally traditional approach, you never work on stuff like this. But with the CLA, we have the power that we can start to address things like, for instance, you can only stay in each position for 5 seconds. And you have to go somewhere else. Go somewhere else. Go somewhere else. 5 seconds max. Right? And so now you should be developing people's ability to move, right? And that should be forcing them to move around a lot more rather than just immobilizing the partner.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can play that in a way, you could set it up with like time constraints and whatnot, where you're really challenging people's cardio and you're really developing their cardiovascular capabilities in a grappling context, right? You could set it up where the focus of the task is not actually to develop grappling skill. You would still develop some, great side benefit, but now you can really target the cardio in this really specific way that like always is going to be different when you're grappling versus when you're playing soccer versus when you're running on a track versus when you're doing the assault bike versus when you're doing, a CrossFit workout. Like there are functional physiological differences in those things. And we are going to get more out of it when we target it to the sport. I think the question then becomes like, what's the injury risk profile like?
Mm.
What's our risk reward? So for instance, for grappling, my thought right now is to do all your cardio in these high. You could design tasks that like, for instance, you could we call it like Shark Tank people. So you have someone stays in, and then you switch so they get a new partner every 3 or 5 minutes or whatever, and they have
Yeah,
to keep working,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
with a fresh partner so that they develop their cardio. Great. My more mostly intuitive thought right now is that if you try to develop all your cardio with tasks like that, that it's going to be probably a little too high injury risk for what we want,
Yes. Yes.
right? And that
Yes.
like man, when we do the assault bike and the CrossFit stuff, it's like it really is so different. But man, the injury risk is so much lower than trying to redline cardio, right? Especially if you want to do, for instance, if you wanted to do like high intensity intervals on an assault bike, great. Sprinting, great. But like you try to do that in a grappling task, like it's hard to imagine that's not going to have a really high, like not just injury risk, not just of like catastrophic injuries, but also like just getting beat up, you know? Like I
Mm.
noticed, for instance, with dance, when I try to like dance hard and like try to like get my cardio up, get my heart rate up and challenge the cardiovascular capacity while dancing,
Yeah.
it is so hard. Like it's so weird. Like it's, there's something so weird about it where it's so hard to get my heart rate above like, I don't know, 120, 150 versus like, you go for run or assault bike or your more traditional cardio methods. It's so easy to do that. And so when I try to do a cardio sort of workouts with dance, locomotion, movement sort of things without a partner, I'm a lot more beat up after versus when I do some cardio like in traditional ways. Okay, like I can push hard, body feels fine, relatively no injury risk. Um, yeah, so this
The,
just
the only thing I would say though is that I'm not, again, I'm probably not as versed in the literature as you are in terms of things like energy systems and physiological side of things. But it seems to me that so if I totally agree that if you were to be, there would be, if you could guarantee that you wouldn't get injured and you wouldn't get beat up, but you could find a way of doing essentially sparring based cardio full out with no chance of injury, you'd do it, wouldn't you? It would be the ideal thing
100%,
to do, right?
100%.
But because of the safety aspects, you just can't. But then the next thing can't just be cardio bike, right? So because for me
Mm,
that's too like
sure.
surely what you would do is be at the very least throwing a heavy bag like from one side to the other
Hmm.
to the other.
Hmm.
You'd
hmm
you'd be
hmm
manipulating some kind of an object. Yes, it might not be an object that's going to fight back at you, but it's at least you would be on the ground, you would be moving, you would be so you'd be almost creating that sort of Ido Portal style fully dynamic cardio activity that isn't dynamic in the sense of somebody else is trying to rip your head off, but it's got the element of there is a physical thing that you must try and move, which would be more. it would equate that kind of cardio, but it would obviously be safer.
Hmm.
Um, and I just don't know. So I sometimes wonder whether the reason we go to the bike is because it's readily available, or we go running, or we go sprinting, or we go and do jumps and jumping jacks, or whatever it might be. It's because they're readily available, they're cheap and easy and relatively low intensity. But I'm still not convinced of their transferability. So I again sometimes wonder, like, are you just like massively taxing your energy systems for something that's not going to give you that greater benefit? Now, you might say to me, actually, physiologically, there's loads of evidence that actually just taxing your energy system is actually got huge levels of transfer, in which case, fair enough, because we're not talking about skill, we're talking about pure physiological capability. But it strikes me that if you could do something that was developing not just the energy system, but the strength element as well, so that it was more of it had more fidelity to the kind of activities that you would be doing, then that would have a greater potential benefit to that person physiologically. That said, no, sorry, I'm not going to say that said, because I sometimes wonder whether as practitioners, and I feel like this sometimes, I just haven't got enough imagination.
Mm.
Like I need to just give it a bit more time. And in the moment, you can't think it through. But that's why I think if you put, and this is what I'm looking to do. By the way, we have plugged emergence a lot, but we both said before we started that we're both going to be at the Sport Movement Skill Conference. I'm looking forward to running a session at the Sport Movement Skill Conference. First time I've actually been at the Sport Movement Skill Conference live, so very excited about that, and it's going to be great to get together. Um, but one of the things I'm going to be doing is exactly what we've just been talking about, which is we're not going to go to drilling. We know that. We're constraining ourselves away from it. We're putting a dollar in the jar every time we even use the word, right? I'm going to make a fortune. But we're not going to be doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to find the most uh, ecologically advantageous. We're going to look through an ecological lens to find other activities that we can do that don't necessarily when we've got everybody we need to do everything we want in the most enriched environment possible. But what can we do? So let's use our imagination, explore the landscape of constraints, think through the lens of affordances to create activity forms together, co-create them that we may not have thought about before. And what I've always found has been really powerful when you work with coaches from a range of different sports is they always come up with something you never would have thought of because you're too constrained by your own sport actions. Well, couldn't you just do this? Yeah. What if you took your shoes off? What? Oh, that's a good idea. That kind of thing. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm looking forward to explore. It's a big plug for SMSC, but I don't mind doing that on this show because they're friends. But that's what I mean, like the creativity, the co-creation when you get together with other coaches from different areas and you think about it ecologically and you begin to start to experiment with ideas, even with athletes, co-creating with the athletes. I would just wonder where we could go actually to develop like the physiological capabilities within athletes. Don't know.
Yeah, my thinking is the same as yours. Like, as man, like I want to find those tasks that can do that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
I guess it's I haven't found them yet.
No, yeah,
So
yeah.
and that's probably the main thing. And hopefully I'll look back on this conversation in 2 years and be like, oh dude, what an idiot, you know? Like there's all this stuff, you know? But I guess what's holding me back right now is I guess like it's a traditional strength and conditioning stuff as far as like it's really nice to target the variables. You know, it's nice to say, boom, we're gonna stay at 200 watts for 5 minutes. Um, and it's nice to have the progressive overload, right? When we're thinking about developing the physiological capacities, right? The action capacities, it's nice to have that control on those variables. And it feels like most of these tasks, we give up a lot of that control, right? If we're
Yeah.
doing, if again, and that really might just be, we got to think of some better ways to do it. Hopefully,
Yeah.
there's got to be better ways to do it. But the question is, are there ways that are better enough that, like, there's the injury aspect,
Yeah.
and there's also like, it's nice to work at we want to work at the lactate threshold. We want to work at VO2 max. Like, rather than like vaguely kind of working around some of these things, like,
In a 10-minute, so like whenever I watch like submission grappling, which by the way I just endlessly fascinated by, and you watch Musumeci and Rotolo and these guys, like what do you know? Is there any research about what uh heart rate level they're working at?
I'm not sure of any.
Mm.
Um, it's pretty high.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, but I would argue their ability isn't necessarily because they can operate at say 200 for say 3 4 minutes. It's because they can go from 200 to pretty well recovered, or no, sorry, not recovered, but more like recovered really quickly. I'm speculating
Yeah,
massively,
yeah.
obviously.
I mean, well, like the reality is like at the actual practical functional level, it's skill. In grappling, skill as far as where you use those watts is like by far trumps everything, right? Or is certainly the most important factor. There's a question of like, okay, skill equated, like having so-called a bigger gas tank is quite helpful. It opens up. For instance, there was an athlete that I talked to that's been quite successful in grappling, and I was talking to him about like, man, like from a strength and conditioning perspective, like what would be the most useful function for you to develop as far as grappling? Like what would help you the most? And my thought was like strength. I was like, what strength function would be the most useful to you? And I've actually been asking like black belts this for the last, I don't know, 5 6 years. Like everyone I talk to, I ask. And but his answer was quite interesting. He was like, actually, I don't think like the strength is so useful for him. Like he was like, I don't really like to use the maximum. Like I want the strength endurance to wear
Mm.
these guys down.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
His game is centered around, again, he's very skilled, very explosive, very strong, but his game is centered around wearing the other guy down and still having more, right?
Yeah,
Still having more at every point. And when you're more skilled, it's easy to do that,
yeah,
or easier.
yeah.
But that's where it's like, yeah, like probably these. I think that's to me. I think right now this is probably another area. I just my thoughts. Like I could be completely wrong on this. I would love to be completely wrong on this, but my thought is that for developing the physiological action capacities, that like these more constrained things might be more helpful.
Yeah.
Like because I think there's just an innate part of this where if you're running tasks where people have the freedom to self-organize an effective movement solution, they're going to find effective movement solutions, and there's going to be a lot of emphasis on how effective the solution is,
Mm.
the skill of doing it, rather than the I'm developing the actual like biceps and the spinal erectors and the glutes, like their maximum tension and the how quickly they can produce force, right? Like
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
again, but then there's a degree to which representativeness may override that in a sport specific way, right? It's like
yeah,
because it's what's very clear is like your grappling is not a competition of who can deadlift the most weight.
yeah,
It's like a completely different thing, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because we're not just applying that strength. It's Because it's not just a question of how much strength you have, it's how you apply the strength that is a totally different thing.
Yeah, I think I'm totally agreeing with you. I think the interesting area, and this is the beauty of it, right? Which is what we're both touching on here is, and this is something that Keith Davids talks about quite a lot. He says the best thing about working as a researcher in the ecological space is the practitioners are leading the research questions. They're the ones now saying, what do we know about this? What do we know about that? And he says, and that's when it's genuinely interesting because not only are the practitioners coming back to the researchers saying, I'm finding this in my practice. Has anybody else, is there any research out there where anyone else has had a similar experience? Don't know, let's find out. Or they're saying, I've got this question I can't solve. What is there a way we could design an experiment so that we could actually just study this in more detail? And so actually that, and this is the beauty of it, is that what you've got is theoretical foundation that's still got, a whole load of ocean of more empirical stuff to be done and practical stuff. So I like to think that as a practitioner, very often, a lot of what I'm doing is untested. It's kind of semi-experimental. I'm using the theoretical underpinnings to shape ideas, and then I'm adapting based on, I go with a experimental design and quite quickly realize that experimental design isn't quite right, and so I have to adapt the experimental design in order to then sort of, and by responding and attuning, that's how I get to where I want to get to with the athlete. So it's this constant dynamic interplay, and I think it's the same with the design practice designs that we're working with, and the training modalities that we're developing. They need to be tuned, they need to be fine tuned, they need to be aligned, and actually, it's going to be practitioner to practitioner. This is something I've tried. What do you think about that? Ah, it's interesting, right? Yeah. What if we did it this way? Oh, yeah, that's even better. That's a really rich way of doing things. Um, the interesting thing about that grappling context as well is that, and one of the things I think that is really, I personally see, and again, this is me with confirmation bias, looking at sport through this lens. But one of the things I see when you look at people like Musamechi Rotolo is uh, they they're able to work at very, very high levels of physiological stress and very, very high levels of psychological stress, but be absolutely clear-headed in what they're doing. And that's often, I think, something that people find difficult because in the ferociousness of battle and the overwhelm that can come with battle, if you haven't experienced it at that level enough, everything else shuts down because you're in survival mode, or everything else shuts down because, and you can't move properly. I've been in these experiences before where limbs don't work properly. Why? Because the stress overload is too high. Why I could do this yesterday. I literally cannot move properly. And that's what Mark's about, which again is one of the reasons why I think hours and hours and hours of when you're little of play-based grappling, relatively safe, task-led, game-led, play-based grappling if you can do thousands of reps of play-based grappling, akin to what you would see two puppies doing or two wolves doing in the wild, but it's that sort of fairly safe, slightly bit of rough and tumble, play-based grappling, but maybe slightly more intentional, using the odd well-designed game that's got some nice constraints built into it. They're the reps you want to be doing. You got these kids in these gyms just doing thousands of push-ups and sit-ups and this, that, and the other. Get them out now. Get them playing. Get them playing the game of grappling so that they naturally develop the physiology, the mentality, their game understanding, the exploratory nature, the problem-solving nature that is associated with play. And then see what happens, and you can build upon that afterwards, and you can refine and adjust and this, that, and the other, and develop their movement capacities and their effectivities as they need those as they emerge. But everybody does it the other way around. They feel like you've got to put the physiological capabilities in first because they're the building blocks of movement. And I just think it's a really flawed concept. And surprise, surprise, kids find it boring and stop being physically active. And that's bloody terrible.
Totally, totally. And there is, I think, as you're mentioning a little bit, like there is definitely that point where it's like, even now, I would say, okay, if maybe we want to develop maximal strength and like VO2 max and lactate threshold on these more isolated things, there is definitely an aspect where it is different to apply those in a representative scenario, right? And there's for a sport, for a specialized athlete, and for a non-specialized athlete, like uh, learning to compete when you're fatigued or grapple when you're fatigued is something that you don't learn on the assault bike at all, right?
Mm.
And so even if you want to develop, if we say you need to develop that to like get to a super, super high competitive world class level, um, then you also need to learn how to apply that in a representative scenario, right? You can't learn that even with the mildly representative things, right? You want now that's where, yeah, that's where we would say, okay, maybe we're not developing the physiological capacities, or our main work to develop action capacities is in more isolated things, in things that look maybe less like tasks and more like traditional strength and conditioning. But we need to learn to apply it with tasks. And we need to learn the skill and develop the skill with tasks too.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, listen, I've just looked at the time. We've just been smashed on for like 2 hours. It's unbelievable. I could go on, but I'm going to run out of time. I've deeply enjoyed the conversation. Um, I've deeply enjoyed your patience at listening to me rant on when I'm supposed to be a podcast host. I'm the worst ever. Um, but Brett, really appreciate your time joining me, and it's been a great conversation, and very much looking forward to meeting you face to face later in the year.
Sounds great, Stuart. Me too. Thanks for having me on.
Before we do depart, if people wanted to reach out, they're into your because you're not just grappling. I know we've talked a lot about grappling, but you do all elements of movement, and it's about movement exploration, all those sorts of things. If people want to find you, they want to pick up the episodes of the documentary that you're producing, which is great, or they want to reach out and maybe work with you. What's the best way for them to get in touch?
Best way to get in touch is through the website, or I have a link tree actually that you can contact me through. People can just like schedule a call actually.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to contact me, go through there. And if you want to see some of my content and some of the things I've been putting enormous amounts of work into, then there's a YouTube channel, Bren Teaches Movement.
It is a great channel. I highly recommend it. I derive great enjoyment from it on a regular basis. And so, please like, subscribe, do all that jazz. So I'll say that for you, Brent, so that you don't have to. But it is important for the algorithm and all that sort of stuff. Hey, listen, thanks a lot for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation. And like I said before, keep up the great work and look forward to further conversations later on.
Sounds great. Thanks, Stuart.